we go. Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 23 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I am your host, Melissa Whitecross, coming to you live from Johannesburg, South Africa. We'd like to remind all of you that our shows are recorded and available on YouTube. So if you miss out because the lights go dark, you can always catch up later. And while you're there, please remember to click that subscribe button and grow support for our channel. Tonight, we will be unpacking the environmental impact assessment process with the BirdLife South Africa policy and advocacy team. But before we get to that, just a reminder to communicate with us using the chat and Q&A feeds in Zoom or the comment feed on Facebook Live. And we'll be answering some of these questions at the end of tonight's webinar. We are on all major social media channels, and you can use the hashtag Conservation Conversations to let us know what you think of the show. A big thanks as always to the generous contributions towards our webinars, and these help us to keep these shows free for all to learn and enjoy. Simply visit the Cricket page or EFT BirdLife South Africa directly and use the reference webinars with your name. As I said earlier, we have just 3 days to go until the African Bird Fair, taking place on Friday and Saturday this week. Most of the event is free, but space is limited. So book your spot now by registering via the BirdLife South Africa website and be part of the biggest event in African birding this year. This event will include must-see speakers, educational birding workshops, one of which I will be hosting on grassland birds, a live virtual birding safari, art displays, coloring in competitions for the kids, amazing deals, including the likes of accommodation, wine, art, travel, and more in our silent auction, and 20% discount on BirdLife South Africa membership, as well as Swarovski and Zeiss lens cleaning offerings at our Isdal House in-person event. There's also the inaugural or the annual quiz night, which is sure to be another fun event, and loads more. We are certainly looking forward to seeing you all later this week. But I would encourage all of you to pop on over to the site early, as our silent auction items are now available for bidding. We're going to run the bidding a little bit longer this year. So all you need to do is pop on over to the virtual African Bird Fair platform on the Event Mobi link. And once you have done that, you can navigate your way to the silent auction tab and start perusing the amazing items on offer to make sure that you can get your bids in when they open. One of the big items I would recommend bidding on is the Wilderness Hotel, which has put up 3 rooms, and they will be useful at next year's Flock to Wilderness event. So if you are planning on attending next year's Flock, I would highly recommend trying to nab one of those Wilderness Hotel accommodation vouchers. But our last event to promote this evening is the Cycle in the Bush event, another not to miss one happening. All you have to do is grab your 2 wheels and foray into the Big 5 country at Salati Game Reserve with the BirdLife South Africa team. Your fee will include luxury accommodation, guided activities, as well as talks and interactions with BirdLife South Africa's staff. The spots are limited, and there are saddles available that you can also rent if you do not have a bicycle, but the proceeds of all of this are going to be going to the Regional Conservation Program. But finally, on to our main event this evening. BirdLife South Africa does a lot to conserve our country's birds and their habitats. But much of this important conservation work takes place behind laptops and through high-level engagements with government, the environmental sector stakeholders, and developers. Joining us tonight to unpack some of the important conservation work being carried out in the legal space is Policy and Advocacy Program Manager, Dr. Melissa Lewis, and she's joined by her team members, Samantha Ralston-Paton, the Birds and Renewable Energy Project Manager, and Dr. Kirsten, Advocacy Officer at BirdLife South Africa. And supporting our P&A ladies this evening, the Rose Amongst the Thorns, is Ernst, who is no stranger to our webinar series and is BirdLife South Africa's Spatial Planning and Data Project Manager. I know tonight is going to be one of our more technical webinars, but I guarantee you will learn something. So stay tuned and you'll certainly leave better equipped to help us safeguard biodiversity together. So Mel and team, I'm going to hand over to you just to say hello to everybody, and then we will get into tonight's webinar.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We're really looking forward to giving you a bit of an overview of our policy and advocacy work, and of course to be joined by our honorary member, Ernst, Retief. Yeah, I'll let the rest of the team also just briefly introduce themselves. Sam?
Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Yeah, I'm particularly looking forward to the discussion. So, yeah, I pose your questions. Let's have some lively discussion at the end of it. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Day, and I'm really looking forward to interacting with everyone out there. And I hope that we have some fruitful discussions.
Hi everyone, I'm Retief from our Science Innovation team, and I'm excited to chat today about how we use data in conservation planning. Exciting topic for me.
Good evening everyone, and thanks so much for joining us tonight. Now, if you have an interest in birds and bird conservation, I'm sure you're all very aware that our birds and their habitats are unfortunately facing a wide variety of threats. And indeed, we at BirdLife South Africa frequently receive questions from members of the public expressing concern about the threats that are facing our birds, especially those associated with various types of development. And the unfortunate reality is that these are only becoming all the more pronounced with the current push to expedite economic development. And of course, economic development is necessary. Of course, social development is necessary. But it's also crucial that this occur in an ecologically sustainable way. So, from a bird conservation perspective, in addition to BirdLife South Africa's on-the-ground conservation work, we recognize that it's imperative that the areas that are most important to birds be properly reflected in South Africa's conservation planning, and that birds and their habitats receive proper consideration in government's policy making and in government's decision making, especially when it comes to decisions regarding whether or where to authorize particular development activities or other activities that are potentially harmful. So what we thought we'd do this evening is provide a bit of an overview of what BirdLife South Africa is doing to try and ensure that this happens, and provide a few tips for how you can help. So just now, Ernst is going to be providing an overview of the role of bird-related data in conservation planning. Then Sam is going to hone in on BirdLife South Africa's policy and advocacy programs work in one particular sector, namely renewable energies. And then to round things off, Kirsten is going to be providing some tips on how you can make your voice heard in South Africa's environmental impact assessment processes. But before we go into all of those specifics, I thought I'd just provide you with a broad overview of BirdLife South Africa's policy and advocacy program so that you can understand where it fits into the organization and the scope of our work. Right, so if you've been following these webinars, you'll be aware that BirdLife South Africa's Conservation Division is divided into a number of programs. Two of these are cross-cutting in the sense that they provide various forms of support to the rest of the Conservation Division. And when we're talking about the policy and advocacy program specifically, this is a relatively small program, only 2 full-time staff members, 1 part-time staff member, but we work very closely with other staff from across the organization. So our work with the seabird conservation program at present focuses largely on trying to avert threats to the Benguela coastal seabirds, such as the endangered African penguin. Our work with the landscape conservation program concentrates on averting threats to BirdLife South Africa's stewardship sites and flagship species, such as the critically endangered white-winged flufftail. Our Birds and Renewable Energy project is currently collaborating very closely with the Empowering People program to develop training materials for bird monitors. And then we also work very closely with our regional conservation program to provide policy and advocacy support to BirdLife partners in other African countries that oftentimes lack dedicated policy staff. And so we try to provide them with advice, to share experiences, and at times to develop joint positions and statements. Yeah, but what is the overarching mission of our program? Well, essentially, we endeavour to safeguard priority habitats and species by doing two things. Firstly, trying to ensure that conservation objectives are integrated into relevant laws and policies. Secondly, by trying to ensure that these laws and policies are actually properly implemented in practice. And there are a number of points that I'd like to raise about our work from the outset, and then I'll go into each of these in a bit more detail with examples. But the first is that our law and policy work operates at multiple levels. The second is that rather than trying to reactively tackle a large number of applications at project level, we try to be more proactive in our approach by looking for ways to strengthen impact assessments and decision-making in general. And then where possible, we try to work constructively with government and other stakeholders to find solutions rather than being purely adversarial. And that's not to say that we never challenge particular development applications or development decisions, but it is to say that we choose our battles carefully. Just to unpack those points in a bit more detail, first of all, what do I mean when I say that our law and policy work occurs at multiple levels? Well, essentially I mean that in addition to endeavouring to influence South African law and policy, certainly at the national level and in some instances at the provincial and even occasionally the local level, our work does also have an international dimension, which is important because the conservation commitments and targets that are agreed to in international instruments influence the conservation actions that are taken in South Africa and indeed in other countries with which we share so many species of birds. So we consider this engagement with these types of frameworks to be very worthwhile. And there are a number of ways in which we go about this. Firstly, by working as a member of the BirdLife Partnership. This is one of the benefits of being part of a global partnership, and we do often have the opportunity to sit on the BirdLife International delegation to various negotiations, as is currently the case in the negotiation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which, amongst other things, will be setting targets that states must endeavour to achieve by 2030. Then when it comes to migratory bird instruments specifically, we've got a very strong working relationship with the South African government. In fact, we've got a memorandum of understanding with the South African government in terms of which we agree to support it in the implementation of these instruments. And as a result, we are closely involved in supporting government in the preparation of its negotiating positions, as is currently the case for preparations for the meeting of the parties to the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement, which is occurring in September. And then finally, we do also play a coordinating role, specifically in the context of international species working groups. And the policy and advocacy program's most direct involvement in one of these is our coordination of the Lesser Flamingo International Working Group, which was recently reconstituted, and I'm currently in the process of engaging with 11 African countries, essentially with a view to developing an implementation plan to coordinate conservation actions across the species full range. Right, so swinging back to our work in South Africa, as I mentioned, we try to be proactive and strategic in trying to strengthen the quality of impact assessments. And the principal way in which we do this is through the development of guidelines and the mainstreaming of these guidelines. So Sam will be discussing this in a lot more detail in the renewable energy context. But I just also wanted to highlight that we have previously been involved in a collaborative project to develop a species environmental assessment guideline, which supplements relatively recent legal requirements regarding specialist assessments in EIAs. And this is closely linked to the environmental screening tool that both Ernst and Kirsten are going to be discussing just now. Essentially, the screening tool identifies environmental sensitivities for an area. It also identifies the types of specialist assessments that are necessary as a result of those sensitivities. And then the guideline in turn describes how impacts on species of conservation concern are to be assessed and reported on as part of the EIA process. And then at present, we're also currently undertaking a project to develop and mainstream guidelines on the mitigation hierarchy. This is a joint endeavour with the Endangered Wildlife Trust and Enviro Insights. And basically, this guideline is intended to supplement a guideline on biodiversity offsets, which was recently gazetted for public comment. Now, as I mentioned, when it comes to trying to avert specific threats to species and their habitats, we do try to engage constructively where possible, and we do this by participating in various species-specific or issue-specific fora. An example of the first type of forum is the White-winged Flufftail National Working Group, which is responsible for coordinating and monitoring the implementation of the International Single Species Action Plan for the white-winged flufftail at national level. And we found this to be a pretty valuable forum for engaging national governments in respect of the threats facing the species and its habitat, in particular mining-related threats in Mpumalanga. And then an example of an issue-specific forum is the Offshore Operations Stakeholder Forum and its associated working group, which brings together a wide range of stakeholders and organs of state to discuss issues pertaining to what's referred to as ship-to-ship bunkering, so essentially the offshore transfer of fuel from one ship to another, which as you may be aware, has caused quite a lot of controversy in recent months. And we've spent a lot of time in the first half of this year engaging with other stakeholders on this forum in an endeavour to ensure that this activity undergoes an appropriate environmental risk assessment, specifically for Algoa Bay, and to try and ensure that a more robust authorization process is put in place. And then finally, where it makes strategic sense to do so, we do submit detailed comments on the environmental impact assessments for specific development projects, and if need be, challenge unfavourable authorizations through the administrative appeals process, and very occasionally through the courts. So the clips on the slide give you an indication of some of the more high-profile matters on which we've objected in recent years. The only one that we're actually litigating over at present concerns the approvals for an underground coal mine on properties that until recently had formed part of the Mabola Protected Environment, which is situated in a strategic water source area in Mpumalanga. And on that matter, we're currently a party to 4 court challenges as part of a coalition of civil society organizations being represented by the Centre for Environmental Rights. But really, litigation would tend to be the exception rather than the rule, because it is an inherently risky activity and oftentimes a prohibitively expensive activity as well. So on that note, a massive thank you for your attention. Thank you also to the funders of our program, and I'll turn you over to Ernst to hear about the role of bird-related data in conservation planning in South Africa.
Hi everyone. Welcome to the short presentation where I will briefly summarize how we use different bird-related data sets, such as data from the Southern African Bird Atlas project, to support conservation planning in South Africa. But let's first briefly discuss what is meant by conservation planning. Conservation planning can be defined as the process of locating, configuring, implementing, and maintaining areas that are managed to promote the persistence of biodiversity, or in simple terms, to map the areas that are important for the conservation of biodiversity. The first step in any conservation initiative is to know where species and the habitats they use occur. Only when you know where, for example, threatened bird species occur, can you effectively conserve them. Conservation planning is therefore a crucial element of sustainable development and help to conserve our natural resources. We are extremely privileged in South Africa to have an extensive conservation planning network. This network is supported by local, provincial, and national government departments and various pieces of legislation. For example, the Biodiversity Act provides for the management and conservation of biological diversity in South Africa. There are also various guidelines and standards that accompany these acts, all valuable tools to assist with the planning process. We do not have the time today to discuss the elements that make up a conservation plan, but it usually consists of a map or maps showing terrestrial and aquatic features that are critical for conservation of biodiversity and maintaining ecosystem functioning. These maps are then accompanied by land use guidelines, for example, to indicate the type of economic activity that can or cannot take place at a site. So, for example, if an area is mapped as of great conservation value, the plan will show that no economic developments, such as a mining development, can take place there. But in other areas which are not environmentally sensitive, the guidelines will show that economic activities can take place and what type of economic activity. To us at BirdLife South Africa, it is essential that areas that are important for the conservation of birds should be flagged correctly on these maps and guidelines, and therefore we spend a lot of time providing data to support this process. However, currently bird data do not feature extensively in these conservation plans, although things have changed a lot in recent years. In addition, some of the data used might be incomplete, or conservation targets might not be applied equally across the country. Our solution is to provide conservation planners with data sets which will assist them in improving their conservation plans so that the birds and the habitats are given protection through various conservation planning tools. We have numerous and extensive bird distribution data sets in South Africa. For example, the excellent data from the Southern African Bird Atlas project, or the point data that we get from the mobile application BirdLife. However, the data cannot be used as is for conservation planning. It must be adapted to comply with published standards. This is one of our aims, to adapt these data sets to a format that can be used by conservation planners. I would just quickly want to give 4 examples of how we do this. The first is the national web-based environmental screening tool managed by the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. The site screening tool is an online tool where any member of the public can obtain a report of any environmental sensitivities at and surrounding the site of a proposed development. This is done when an environmental impact assessment specialist, or as indicated just now, any member of the public, even you, can go on the tool, indicate the footprint of a development, and then request the tool to produce a PDF report. BirdLife South Africa provided spatial layers for 62 threatened bird species, all the species above near threatened, terrestrial bird species above near threatened. We provided spatial layers for these species to this tool. This means that if the area that would be impacted by development overlap with the distribution of these species, the report will flag the species in the PDF report. This means that there is now no excuse for any environmental impact assessment not to include bird data for threatened bird species in their environmental impact assessments. I've previously indicated that one of the main building blocks of conservation planning in South Africa is critical biodiversity areas or critical biodiversity area maps. These maps indicate which area in the country must be maintained in good ecological condition to meet biodiversity targets. We currently have and will in future share our fine-scale habitat suitability models combined with sub-up-to data to conservation planners to ensure that areas that are where our threatened bird species occur will be considered for CBA status. On the map on the bottom right, you can see there's a current conservation state plan for the Northern Cape province. The areas in purple indicate the current CBA areas, and the area in red is our habitat suitability model for red lark. And as you can see, very little of, or basically none of that area is listed as a CBA area, as a critical biodiversity area. We hope that in future conservation plans, they will consider our red lark map and then consider those areas to become CBA areas. The red listing of birds is an important project as it helps the conservation sector to prioritize conservation efforts. BirdLife South Africa in 2015 published the 2015 Eskom Red Data Book of Birds of South Africa, Lesotho and Swaziland. To publish this publication, we made extensive use of sub-up-to data to determine which species should be listed as, for example, critical endangered or endangered. I'm now excited to announce that we are busy updating this book, and we hope to plan to publish a new Red Data book in a few years. This work already started in 2021. We again will make extensive use of sub-up-to data, and we will now also have extensive BirdLife point data, and we will use these data sets in exciting ways to determine the threat status of birds in South Africa. This is a really exciting initiative, and you will learn more about this project in the coming years. In 2015, we published the Important Bird and Biodiversity Area Directory in South Africa. This directory listed areas that we believe are important for the conservation of birds. We made extensive use of sub-up-to data and BirdLife data for this specific project. Currently, we are assisting SANBI to develop a new key biodiversity areas network. Now, I don't have the time today to discuss the details of what KBAs are all about, but KBAs will not only include birds, but also other taxons such as plants and amphibians and mammals, etc. But we are using sub-up-to data and our habitat suitable models to inform what this new KBA network should look like. And again, it just shows again the value of data such as the sub-up-to data. This is just 4 examples to show how we use existing data sets to inform conservation planning in South Africa. There are many more examples that I can probably refer to, but we do not have the time today to discuss those. But you might ask, how can I help in this process, and how can we help to support this conservation planning initiative? And my answer is that the most and the easiest way to do that is to become a citizen scientist and contribute to a project like the Southern African Bird Atlas Project. If you're a current atlas, thank you very much. Your data are extremely valuable, and I hope I've shown today how extensively we use your data in various ways to inform conservation planning in South Africa. The second way is to support the various courses on BirdLife, such as the threatened species course. We use this point data that we get from the species course extensively, and it is becoming a really valuable tool. So please go to BirdLife and the settings and courses and support the threatened species course on BirdLife. That then, in short, is my talk about how we support conservation planning in South Africa through using the various data sources that are available. And I want to thank ICAPA, RMB, and the Fort Wildlife Foundation for supporting our work.
Good evening, everybody. So I'm Sam Ralston-Paton. I am the Birds and Renewable Energy Project Manager at BirdLife South Africa. I'm going to give you a really quick overview of just some of the work that we've been doing over the past years. And at the end, I'm going to share with you some suggestions about how you as bird lovers can support a more nature-friendly transition to renewable energy. I always think that we can't speak about renewable energy without a bit of a reality check. South Africa's electricity is at the moment amongst the most carbon intensive in the world. And around 85% of our electricity comes from coal, which I'm sure you'll agree is not a situation we want to perpetuate. The good news is that wind energy in South Africa is on the increase. At the moment, we have the most installed capacity of wind energy on the continent. And this is thanks largely to the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, which was introduced in 2011. And we can anticipate to see much more wind turbines on our landscape in the near future. Our integrated resources plan has earmarked 11.5 gigawatts to come from wind by 2030. That's around 3,000 turbines. And while this might be good for climate change mitigation and might help alleviate some of our electricity woes in the country, it does present a challenge for biodiversity conservation. Wind turbines and associated infrastructure can cause habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation. But amongst the biggest concerns are that birds and bats can be killed by the rapidly moving turbine blades. Birds of prey, unfortunately, and many of them threatened species, are amongst the species most at risk of turbine fatalities. So this is often touted as a green versus green conundrum, and by implication we need to choose between renewable energy and biodiversity conservation. At BirdLife South Africa, we don't believe that this is necessary or appropriate. We believe that by placing renewable energy infrastructure in the right place and managing it correctly, there is certainly space for both biodiversity and renewable energy. And that's really where the Birds and Renewable Energy project has been focusing its attention. So over the last 10 years, we have been supporting the responsible development of renewable energy by promoting scientific evidence-based decisions. So one of the first problems we encountered way back in 2010, 2011, when we first started seeing a flood of wind energy proposals, was that the wind energy industry was super competitive. Everybody wanted to get their projects approved as quickly as possible. So that meant that the standard of environmental impact assessments could be inconsistent, and it was often poor because developers that were prepared to commit to longer, more rigorous EIA processes were essentially penalized because they lost the competitive edge. So one of the first things that was done is that BirdLife South Africa, together with the Endangered Wildlife Trust and a group of experts on the Birds and Renewable Energy Specialist Group, developed guidelines on impact assessment and monitoring, essentially setting the standard of how impact assessments should be done. Guidelines are just guidelines. The biggest challenge is to actually make sure that they're implemented, and that's really where the project's been focusing its attention. So we promoted the implementation of the guidelines through a multi-pronged approach, including securing endorsement from industry, getting commitment from the biodiversity specialists that they agreed what was necessary. We commented on EIAs, and where necessary, we submitted a couple of strategic appeals to EIA decisions. As a result, the guidelines have been implemented across pretty much all wind farms in South Africa since around 2012, 2013. Although there are a couple of hiccups with some of the details, we certainly did raise the standard of impact assessments from those earlier projects. And in 2020, national assessment and reporting protocols were gazetted, essentially giving legal effect to some of our key recommendations. Another one of the challenges that we face in South Africa in terms of predicting impacts is that wind energy is new. So there's very limited scientific literature on what the actual biodiversity impacts are. Specialists need to rely on research from North America and Europe. One of the nice things about having our guidelines widely implemented is that post-construction monitoring and reporting of impact has happened at pretty much all operational phase wind farms in South Africa. And these reports are sent to BirdLife South Africa, giving us a really nice bird's eye view of what's happening across all operational wind farms. So we've been able to contribute to that limited scientific literature. And importantly, we're beginning to be able to test assumptions made in the EIAs and have an early warning of the potential risk of cumulative impacts on some species. The Black Harriers are a really nice case study of why testing assumptions made in the EIAs is so really very important. Black Harrier is an endangered species, it's endemic, it's got a small population, and because they're generally found in low numbers at proposed development sites, and they tended to fly below the rotor-swept area, they weren't given enough attention in the EIAs. The assumption was that the risk of collisions was pretty low. Unfortunately, operational phase monitoring has revealed that this assumption was flawed, and we've had, unfortunately, fatalities at a couple of wind farms in South Africa already. Becoming aware of this problem, BirdLife South Africa teamed up with species expert Dr. Rob Simmons, and we quickly developed species guidelines to try and improve the standard of impact assessments and find out how we can best mitigate the risk to the species. And it turned out that this intervention was really timely because subsequent research has shown that if we increase the fatality rate of Black Harriers by just 5 adults a year, the population is likely to go extinct in 75 years. This is really worrying because at the moment, even though wind energy is still fairly much in its infancy in South Africa, we are already seeing just over 1 adult killed a year thanks to wind energy. So clearly, rapid intervention is necessary. So as my previous slide probably alluded to, another challenge that we've encountered is that specialists' approach to assessing and mitigating impacts on threatened species in particular also varied quite a lot, and sometimes recommendations weren't well over, or at least clearly justified in their assessments. And that just the sheer number of EIAs made it impossible for BirdLife South Africa or any other stakeholder to engage in each and every EIA process. This is just a map of all the proposed renewable energy developments throughout South Africa. BirdLife South Africa, we've commented on over 100 proposed projects, wind energy projects, and another 50 solar energy projects. And it's just impossible to keep a handle on all of this. So our response was to develop guidelines like the Black Harrier guidelines, but we've also developed guidelines on Cape Vulture and Varroa's Eagle. And the idea with these is that they look at what the science says in terms of the risk to the species as well as mitigation measures. And they essentially provide spatial guidance that can be used by developers in their project planning and site screening, as well as advice on where we need to strengthen those impact assessments. And I don't think we can claim responsibility for this alone. Our successes are thanks to input from a number of specialists, Birds and Renewable Energy Specialist Group, our partners and supporters. But thanks to the interventions that we've managed to put in place in South Africa, I'm confident that we've helped avoid literally hundreds of threatened bird fatalities from wind farms every year. I'm not going to lie to you, our work really is cut out for us. If we can anticipate the growth in renewable energy that has been predicted both in South Africa and on the continent, we can't afford to take our finger off this pulse. So we need your help. So how can you help? I think Ernst has already highlighted how valuable your SAB-app data, your bird atlasing data is in terms of providing foundational knowledge that we can then develop resources like habitat suitability models that can help inform site screening and impact assessments. Not as much fun as going birding, but if you can, do comment on environmental impact assessments. We simply can't get to everything. And if you need us to weigh in on particularly problematic projects, please do alert us if you're aware of problems. Not biodiversity related, but I do like to remind people that the greenest electricity out there is energy efficiency, not wind or solar energy. And if you can, please do support us. You can support us by donating through our website, or if you're interested in partnering or sponsoring some of our work, please do drop me an email. My contact details are in the next slide. And you can support us by spreading the word, making sure that people are aware of this issue and aware of the resources available to try and resolve this issue. So a big thank you. Big thank you to Investec and to all our partners and stakeholders who've contributed to our successes over the last 10 years. And I look forward to your inputs and discussion.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kirsten Day, and I'm an advocacy officer for BirdLife South Africa. The focus of my contribution this evening is to provide you with guidance on how to effectively participate in and comment on environmental impact assessments. So in South Africa, we have a highly developed legislative framework for environmental impact assessments. And as a result, there are a tremendous number of environmental impact assessments that are submitted for consideration and for making decisions on developments every year. An average of 3,600, which effectively boils down to almost 8 to 10 a day EIAs being submitted to the authorities. Part of the reason why there are so many is because we have a list of over 200 controlled activities in South Africa which require an environmental impact assessment. And whilst there are many advantages to have this relatively large number of EIAs being conducted in South Africa compared to other countries, it does mean as well that often the EIA reports are more of a tick box type of assessment than a proper, useful, independent, objective, and worthwhile decision-making tool. So given the number of EIAs that are undertaken and the number of EIAs we receive in our advocacy inbox, we really do suffer from a limited number of resources. I was recently in the UK visiting and attending a meeting of our counterparts at the lodge in Sandy outside London. And I must say I was quite envious of the relatively high proportion of people to bird species they have in the UK compared to our advocacy team, given the relative higher number of bird species in South Africa and the vastness of the habitats that we are trying to protect. But the important thing to remember when participating in EIAs is that to be involved in environmental decision-making is a constitutional right, and there is also a duty on behalf of the authorities to enact and enforce legislation that prevents pollution, promotes conservation, and secures ecologically sustainable development. And there are also a number of other rights that are complementary to this right. For example, the right of access to information, particularly when it affects our environmental rights, the right of procedurally fair administrative justice and procedurally fair decision-making, the right of access to courts and equality before the courts. And then also, if we are unhappy about environmental decision-making, we have the right to protest. So against the background of those constitutional rights, there are really two key areas of conformance that applies to all EIAs. First of all, they must be procedurally correct, and those procedures are defined in the environmental impact regulations as well as the guideline documents that go with those regulations and complement those regulations, which are available on the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment's website. Then there are also a set of principles contained in the National Environmental Management Act, as well as a set of codes of practice or codes of ethics that the environmental assessment practitioners and scientists that contribute to EIAs need to comply with. And those can be found at the Environmental Assessment Practitioners Association's website and the South African Council of Natural Scientific Professions website. And all EIA practitioners have to be registered with IPASA, and all natural scientists have to be registered with SACNASP in order to contribute and write reports for environmental impact assessments. So although the legislative framework is quite complex, essentially an EIA boils down to 5 essential steps, irrespective of the location or scale of the EIA. First of all, issues must be screened in order to identify what is potentially significant. Then there must be a collaborative way of scoping the issues to decide on what the priorities are. And such scoping must be done on the basis of public participation, either through public meetings or through asking for written comment or through small group meetings and through advertising. But it is essential that the public are involved in that scoping process. There is then the process of assessing and evaluating the impacts in order to confirm their significance. And then this must form the basis for identifying potential mitigation and management opportunities. And insightful and wise recommendations must then be made to the decision maker, which is generally the provincial department responsible for environmental affairs, and in some cases, the national department, depending on the scale of the development and whether it crosses boundaries. Another essential part of the EIA process is the application of the screening tool. It has recently become a mandatory part of EIAs. It is essentially a database which contains a number of different layers, including a vegetation layer, various species layer, an aquatic wetland layer. And essentially, these are all overlaid to determine the sensitivity of a site. And Ernst has already mentioned the contribution that BirdLife South Africa makes to the screening tool. And the nice thing about the screening tool is that although it is designed for environmental impact assessment, it is available to any member of the public to go into the DFFE's website and use this tool to identify an area that might be sensitive. And once a sensitivity has been identified as being high, there are certain requirements, certain protocols that must be followed in order to assess the site properly, and certain specialist studies that must be undertaken. So just in terms of commenting on an EIA and the most important things to watch out for, you don't necessarily need to know a lot about the science. You don't need to know a lot about the evidence. There are some very basic sort of tick box type of approaches that you can follow in order to check the credibility of an EIA. For example, who is the applicant and do they have a track record in whichever activity they want you to take? Is the assessment practitioner qualified and registered with IPASA? Are the specialists qualified and registered with the South African Council for Natural Scientific Professions? Do they meet the standard for being ethical, independent, and objective in terms of Section 2 of the National Environmental Management Act? Do you understand the language that is used in the report? And this is not only about translating the report into a suitable and accessible languages, but also not using overly complex terminology and providing a basic executive summary of the findings. And then have you had at least a minimum of 30 days and plenty of opportunity to comment on the reports that are produced during the impact assessment process? Then some further things to look out for. Has a reference number been included? And have you got the name and contact details of the case officer? If not, you have a right to ask for those. Have all your comments and all your concerns been raised and responded to and recorded in the report that goes to the decision maker? Has the sensitivity of the site been assessed not only directly where the activity will have an effect, but also in the surrounding areas? And have the cumulative impacts been taken into account? Has reference been made to other relevant planning legislation, relevant planning policies, such as the Spatial Development Framework and the Environmental Management Framework? And these documents will be available from the municipality. And then finally, have the socioeconomic development sort of ambitions been balanced and seen as complementary and rather than competing with the biophysical or the environmental considerations? Often undue emphasis is placed on number of jobs, contribution to the economy, without recognizing that without maintaining our biophysical value of the environment, then we stand to lose the benefits and the services that the environment can offer present and future generations. So this is just a brief example of a report that came into our advocacy inbox about a week ago, and immediately this type of report, it's a specialist study for a proposed coal mine, would ring a few alarm bells. First of all, just the spelling of words, which one would think that if you are a biodiversity specialist, you would know how to spell aquatic or terrestrial. The fact that the applicant is identified by a Gmail address rather than a full company name, which makes you wonder about the credibility of the applicant and whether they have a track record in mining. The fact that there are no details about who prepared the report and what their qualifications are, and then some clear copying and pasting in this proprietary information, including this quite bizarre statement that the environmental assessment practitioner doesn't accept responsibility for the contents of the report, which really does defeat the aims of an environmental assessment, which should provide scientific, credible, and evidence-based information to allow the authorities to make sensible decisions. So just to finish off with, one thing to always bear in mind, that you can approach the authorities directly. You don't always have to work through the EIA practitioner. And then also when asking for help, for example, from BirdLife South Africa, it is always best to be as specific as possible, to refer to the procedural requirements, to refer to the principles, and to rather ask specific questions. We always find it very difficult if bird clubs or other stakeholders simply send us an EIA or a development proposal and ask, what do we think? As I previously mentioned, we see so many of these EIA applications, and it is really, really difficult to comment on each and every one of them. So we really appreciate your help in applying your own minds, and also given the fact that you often know the areas better than we do, it is really helpful to collaborate on commenting on these EIA applications. Part of our strategy to encourage such collaboration is that we will be putting a helpful guideline, hopefully, onto our website in due course within the next couple of weeks. And this will spell out exactly, cover the tips that we've provided or that I provided in the short presentation, and just help give you some advice in terms of commenting and becoming involved in environmental decision making. So thank you very much again for your support, and also thank you to the RSBP for supporting the work of our policy and advocacy team.
That was a fantastic presentation, and I'm going to invite all of you to join me back on screen, please, if you are still there. But Mel, Sam, Ernst, and Kirsten, thank you so much. I certainly learned a hell of a lot, and I spend a lot of time in this industry. So thank you guys for really distilling all of that down so clearly. And Kirsten, there was a comment in the chat feed from Ray Lazarus asking if it's possible to get copies of those slides, with it being so useful, and maybe in the interim while you polish off those engagements, that could be something that we could put up on the policy and advocacy website, a sort of quick guide to fact-checking those EIAs that come through. And yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if you'd like to respond to that first.
Sure, we can definitely make those available. The guide that we are intending to publish as well will also provide more detail. Unfortunately, we could really only scratch the surface in such a short presentation, but hopefully we will put out a more comprehensive list as well, a checklist of all the things that you can go through when reviewing an EIA.
Thanks, Kirsten. I'm sure that will be enormously helpful. And as the team has mentioned, we certainly do appreciate all of you who go out there and register as interested and affected parties and go that extra mile to provide those comments. It certainly is one huge way that you can make a difference as the public out there to help us in safeguarding our biodiversity. We've got a couple of questions coming through, and thanks, Ernst. I know you've answered a few. I'm going to let you answer the one that you've indicated here. This is from Ingrid, and Ingrid, it's great to have you with us. With regards to conservation planning, she was asking whether BirdLife South Africa is looking at incorporating regional considerations beyond just sites and ensuring biological connectivity through corridors at the regional scale.
Yes, thank you, Ingrid, for that question. A very interesting one. And definitely, so currently we focus mostly on threatened bird species, for example, the data that we feed into the site screening tool. But on my rather long to-do list is to also create corridors or layers, spatial layers for corridors, for instance, between protected areas and other important sites for birds. My previous colleague, Robin Collane, already published a paper on this about corridors between forests in the KZN province. And so that's a good starting point. But definitely, it's on our to-do list. These corridors are extremely important, and we definitely would like to see that those areas are also considered, for example, for critical biodiversity area maps and other, even feeding into something like the site screening tool, etc.
Absolutely. And just to give everyone an idea, these habitat suitability models have certainly been a game changer for us at BirdLife South Africa and in South Africa in general. But how long roughly does it take to really craft the data needed and ultimately reach the point where we've got a usable habitat suitability model? And bear in mind, everyone, that we've got close on 900 bird species occurring in South Africa at this point. So
yeah, no, it's quite a long process. There's various layers that you need to prepare. Now, you need to do that once, but there's a whole set of data layers that we prepared to run the data against. But what's taking me really long is the data, the point data for each bird species that you need to feed in. That data needs to be really accurate. For instance, we use birdclasser data, but birdclasser point is where the bird stands. It's not, for instance, the water bird is not in the water. So what we found in the beginning is that we can't use the data as is. We need to move those points to a place, what's the habitat that the specific bird is using. So that takes me a lot of time to move or to edit, let's say, a 500 or 1,000 records. And then just to run the tool sometimes take between 10 and 12 hours just for one species. So it's a really, really long process. And then also we need to validate and maybe rerun the tool and so on. So it takes quite a long time. But I believe spending the time and doing it right produce a better product and one that's much more accurate and so on.
Absolutely, garbage in and garbage out, as they say in the modeling world. But thanks, Ernst. Certainly a massive task, and I know how many hours it's taken you to comb through all those couch luggers who have lugged a yellow-breasted pipit when they got home from Vakkerstrom instead of lugging it when they saw it in the field. But keep at it, and it certainly is a very valuable resource. So thank you for the huge role that you've played in that. I'm going to jump over to Sam now. And this links to a question that Susie Brownlee pitched around the sort of perception of competent authorities relying heavily on these specialist opinions. And just to sort of distill her question down, how can we get the situation improved where the sort of growing number of EIAs coming through are getting these hawk eyes checking them? So Sam, I know you indicated that you'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. I think it's a really important question, and I must be honest, it's something that keeps me awake at night, is the fact that if anything, we are losing capacity amongst the competent and commenting authorities. So, for example, Cape Nature no longer has an ornithologist. So the pressure is increasing on NGOs like BirdLife South Africa to have those hawk eyes. And it's difficult to step back and be more strategic and build those guidelines and do things like capacity building of commenting authorities when these EIAs are just flying past you. But yeah, so some of the things that we can do is work with the competent and commenting authority to build their capacity. And we already do work a lot with the specialists and we consult them and get their buy-in for guidelines, but it takes a while before we see them properly implemented. I think the role of peer review is essential. One of the big challenges that I'm seeing is that these peer reviews seem to be done within the EIA process. And so I sometimes question whether they are really truly independent. And I think perhaps if the department doesn't have the capacity to review EIAs, perhaps they need to outsource that. But yeah, I struggle with stepping away, and I think NGOs are always going to play an important role. And then, as I mentioned in my presentation, the public commenting on EIAs is essential, and commenting on sites that might not necessarily be in your backyard, but are affecting species or in areas that you care about. Super, super important, because as I mentioned, we just can't get to it all. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sam. And would you mind just elaborating a bit on BirdRisk and what that's all about and what it stands for, please?
Yeah, so the Birds and Renewable Energy Specialist Group is a group of consulting bird specialists. So a lot of the specialists are actually going out and doing the bird specialist studies for proposed renewable energy infrastructure. But because obviously we want to balance the commercial concerns with academic rigor, we've brought a lot of researchers and academics onto that group as well. So the group's chaired by BirdLife South Africa and EWT, and it's both a capacity building and a consulting forum, really. So they review our guidelines before they go out to industry, for example. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. Mel, I'm going to fire this one at you. I was recently at the Soil and Dam Environmental Forum, which is a group of people who've come together in the community to try and do better green activities within their small town. And one of the points that got raised was people find things like NIMBA and the environmental legislation very difficult to access when they're not formally trained. Could you speak to ways that Joe Public, who is not at all trained in any sort of formal legal sense, could access information about NIMBA, how to interpret it, how to use it in their day-to-day activities, and to carry out good green living, as it were, in their towns and municipalities?
Yes, so I find that quite a useful one-stop shop for environmental legislation in South Africa, just for the average Joe Public or even ourselves who don't have access to expensive paid legislative databases, etc., is the Centre for Environmental Rights website. They've got a full legislative database. They've got a lot of just interesting, very easily accessible and understandable materials for the public. And they also publish quite concise updates on recent legal developments and why they're significant. Hopefully, our EIA engagement guideline will also help provide some quite useful and easily accessible and understandable information for the public. And one thing we did also mean to say in that regard is that if any bird clubs or other groups would like a bit more information and engagement with us about how to work with this legislation and how to engage in these processes, please just do give us a shout, because our team would be happy to give your groups a bit of a Zoom presentation and have a bit of a discussion to answer your more detailed questions about all of these matters. As Kirsten said, there wasn't enough time to give detailed advice in this webinar, but we'd be happy to help you out in that regard.
Thank you, Mel. And it certainly is, I know how busy all of your plates are, so that is a massive undertaking by all of you to share your knowledge and skills. We've got a question here talking about the sort of EIA process. And firstly, how much do EIAs cost, sort of rough ballpark figures if we have that kind of information available, and also how is this funding obtained and who's responsible for that? And that's from Shashi. So Mel, if you don't mind tackling that first, and the other panelists are welcome to chip in if they have an answer.
I think that Kirsten might be better positioned to comment on the cost, but ultimately the responsibility for ensuring that an EIA is undertaken is that of the applicant. So the developer has to bear the cost of the EIA and all associated specialist studies. But Kirsten, would you like to add anything about costing of EIAs?
Yeah, I think it is quite a tricky issue. The fact that the developers do have to pay for the EIA to be undertaken, and then they also do pay a small administrative fee to the Department of Environment, or the department responsible for environmental affairs, to have that EIA reviewed and for a decision to be made. Which obviously then begs the question of how can an EIA ever really be totally independent? And yeah, a very important question that is. But as far as the costs are concerned, it can really vary greatly. The table that I showed in my presentation just showed the number of EIAs relative in different countries. And that table is actually part of a bigger table, which does show the costs. And what we realize looking at the costs of EIAs in South Africa versus other countries, we can see that there are many more EIAs undertaken in South Africa, but also at a relatively low cost compared to other countries. And the cost itself varies incredibly from just, tens of thousands rands to millions, depending on the type of development and the scale of the EIA. So a large strategic environmental assessment could cost in the region of millions, whereas a relatively small EIA or a relatively small basic assessment for a small solar plant or something like that can cost in the region of tens of thousands, but it really does vary tremendously.
Absolutely. Would any of the rest of you like to chip in on that, or are we good? All good. Okay, Sam, this next one I'm going to fire at you because I know you've dabbled in the CPD or Continuous Development Program points with SAST. So this one's from Annalie, and she's asking whether there are sort of CPD programs for what she's calling AB conservation, similar to what we find in other industry professions like real estate agents, accountants, doctors. I know when we did the Learn About Birds conference, Sam was instrumental in getting us recognized for the CPD points that conference would hold. But Sam, if you wouldn't mind just speaking to that a little bit more, please.
Yeah, so certainly consulting bird specialists who do those specialist impact assessments do need to be registered with SACNAT. And I am on the spot now. I've forgotten what exactly SACNAT stands for. It's the Council for Natural Scientific Professions, I think, and they do need to earn CPD points. And in fact, attending our forums and reading our guidelines and answering a couple of simple questions do earn those specialist CPD points. So I hope that answered the question properly.
Absolutely, but certainly there is scope for more to be done, I'm sure. But yeah, Sam's guidelines and our webinars and all sorts of things have certainly been hugely valuable, and potentially we could even get this one listed up as a CPD points earning webinar. I'll put that in Sam's court. But yeah, let's move back to Ernst. This one is from Rael, and Ernst, he's asking around the IBA KBA network and the sort of basis for integrating and combining the aspects of science and innovation, policy and advocacy, as we've discussed, and of course, empowering people at both sort of regional and landscape scales. And Rael's asking, what are the factors that will be needed to be prioritized in order to maximize the benefits for birds and biodiversity, but also to mitigate the threats, so that we can plan good connectivity in this new network. And of course, which bird species, both threatened and non-threatened, could be our best surrogates for addressing these kinds of questions. And lastly, who is there to coordinate these kinds of efforts? So a multi-loaded question there, Ernst, but I'm hoping you've had a bit of time to think about an answer.
Yeah, I'm just going to give a short answer to say that I absolutely agree with Raul. As somebody that previously worked in our IBA program, I absolutely love the concept of IBAs and the new KBA network. I really think that IBAs is a good way to garner the support from local people in an area that lives near an IBA. And to help with many of these issues that we discussed today, to collect data, to be our eyes on the ground, for example, when developments take place that is maybe not handled as it should be, etc. So definitely the new KBA network is still a draft network, and we will have to do a lot of work in the coming years to align our work with the new KBA network. And just a question at who's responsible. So IBAs is a BirdLife South Africa initiative, but so the KBA network is a partnership between a number of NGOs, and then also currently managed largely by SANBI. So it is SANBI driven with BirdLife and other organizations as key partners. Yeah, maybe in future we will have a webinar just on a new KBA network, which is quite new and an exciting initiative. But yeah, I definitely agree that we should do more with IBAs and KBAs in future to help with the conservation planning.
Thank you, Ernst. And I'm going to hold you to that future KBA webinar at some point. But Kirsten, I'm going to send this one to you next. This is from Petrus, and he's asking how one deals with EIAs on farms that straddle two provinces, so over a provincial boundary.
Yes, the answer to that is quite straightforward. There is a specific regulation in the EIA regulations that state that if a site straddles provincial boundaries, then the default authority is the National Department for Environmental Affairs. So that would go straight then to the DFFE, and then hopefully they'll be able to take a more strategic decision, because obviously it can't then go to two different provincial departments. You need a single decision maker. So in that case, it would go to the National Department.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. And I think we're going to finish off with this one because I am conscious of the time. But Mel, this one's coming your way from Annalie. And she's asked, what can be done to ensure training of competent staff across different organizations and areas is done continuously?
Thanks, Melissa, and that's a great question because I can use it to punt some of the work that we're going to be doing later this year. So we do recognize that there is an urgent need for training, and this pertains to specialist competence authorities, commenting authorities. And we have been engaging with SANBI about this, and specifically in respect of the Species Environmental Assessment Guideline. We are planning in collaboration with SANBI and Enviro Insight and EWT to, in the second half of this year, develop a series of training materials that will essentially take the form of, the plan is that they're going to take the form of narrated PowerPoints that are accessible online, so that they can be accessed not only on a once-off basis, but when you get new staff in your organization, etc., you need to go back for a bit of a recap on how to use these guidelines. You'll be able to do so. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mel. Team, I think we have reached the end of the road tonight, but all I can do is say a massive thank you to the four of you for the unbelievable amount of effort you put into synthesizing a very complex, nebulous topic into a very accessible and understandable one tonight, and certainly entertaining. So thank you to each of you. I will give you each chance just to say any closing sentiments you'd like to wrap up this evening. We'll start with Mel, go over to Sam, Kirsten, and finish up with Ernst, and then I will close off for the evening.
Just a massive thank you to everyone for their participation and their questions. I think when we when we go into these kinds of presentations, we're always a bit anxious about whether anyone's going to pitch up and whether they're going to stay awake, because the law is often seen as something very boring. But it's great to see all of the encouraging comments in the comments boxes, and to have had all of the insightful questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mel. Sam, Kirsten, either of you got anything more to add?
I would just like to say once again, yeah, thank you very much. And I know that sometimes the whole legal aspect of EIAs and environmental planning can seem very daunting. Just to say, please don't hesitate to contact us with queries, or if you feel overwhelmed by any particular aspect, because we are well placed to be able to provide advice on exactly how to get involved. And please feel free to contact us either through our advocacy inbox or through our personal email addresses. Thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you in future.
Thanks, Kirsten. Sam?
Yeah, just also a massive thanks to everybody for their time from my side. And just a reminder, I think everybody can get overwhelmed by how much that needs to be done in the world, but we can all speak to our strengths, do what we enjoy. If you enjoy nitpicking reports, spend time reading EIAs. If you enjoy birding, go out and bird. Do what you can to make a difference that makes you feel good.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sam. And Ernst?
Yes, thank you very much. And remember, next time you go birding, to lock that date on BirdLife and submit it to SABAP too. Thank you.
Absolutely, and don't do it when you get home on your couch. You don't make life too complicated. Thank you so much, everybody. I'll be back next week. It's my turn in the hot seat. We're going to be talking black storks and their population status in South Africa. Some hot new science off the press. But really looking forward to another great conservation conversations with all of you. As always, thank you for spending your Tuesday nights with us. Keep those eyes on the skies, keep enjoying those birds, and we will see you again 7 o'clock next week, Tuesday. Good night, everybody, and thank you to our panelists this evening.